Hey everyone, my name is Patrick. Welcome to the Undignified Podcast, where we talk about worship, the church, and everything else. I'm so glad you're here at the Undignified Podcast for the second time. And what I mean by that is this is kind of my second run at this podcast. If you don't know me, I'm Patrick. I'm a worship pastor in New York City. I've been here about 17 years, planting churches and leading worship and discipling worship leaders, teaching, etc. And during that time, much like so many church employees out there, I began wearing multiple hats. You know, very rarely do you see someone who works in a church and they say, this is my one job. I specialize in this. There's always these extra things that we do, things that we learn. It's a really interesting place to be working at a church because you do have the opportunity to learn all sorts of new and interesting things, which is also sometimes challenging. But there got to be this point where, you know, our churches were paying for amazing creatives to create these brilliant videos and podcasts and things like that. And there was something in me as someone who is constantly trying to learn new things, constantly interested in new things, where I said, I can do that. So I started to get into, you know, like learning how to do podcasts and make videos for my church. And then I said, well, you know, maybe I could do this, you know, just on my own. You know, I've been teaching in churches, I've been leading worship in churches, and, you know, I've got something unique to share with the world, maybe. And I started with creating a podcast called Undignified Worship. It was bad, folks. It was bad. I mean, the content was bad. I videoed it and it looked bad. More than anything, it sounded bad. And at the very least, I hope this is better. But I know I'm going to look back on this in like a few years and be like, oh, that was garbage, you know, or something like that. We always want to learn. We always want to grow. But this podcast exists for me to have conversations with people who are like me, people who are different than me, that are involved in some sort of aspect of church, the world, worship. I don't know. I focus mainly on, you know, leading worship in the church, creativity in the church, but love to have conversations with anybody. But that tends to be the central theme. And as a worship pastor, I mean, I have those conversations anyway. So having those conversations with interesting people and sharing them with the world, I think is a benefit to those who are interested. So I'm kind of like revamping this podcast. I've got a few episodes already in the bank that I'm so excited for you to hear and watch. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can also watch this on YouTube. You can find me at youtube.com/@ Undignified Worship, or I'll just, I'll put a link down in the show notes. Or if you're on YouTube and you're watching this, you can click the link in the description to listen to my podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. So I'm really excited about what's coming up, but we have to start, I think, by me just sharing, who I am, a little bit of my story. I'm never going to claim to be anyone who you'd want to listen to or need to listen to. But I do think some of the perspective I have and some of the things I have to share are unique. And I will just say this as an aside, I think your voice is unique too. I think your perspective is unique too. I've got a couple different YouTube channels. This is like my second or third podcast that I've created. And you might be thinking like, what's so special about you, Patrick? Well, I would turn it around and say, we're all special. We all have something to share, something to say. You have a unique perspective, whether you work in this country or that country, or you're full-time or you're part-time, or you work from home, or you're full-time in the office, or if you're looking for a job, or if you have this passion or that passion. We all have these unique perspectives to share with the world, and that's all I'm trying to do. So stay tuned for more. I just wanted to share a little bit of my story so you guys can get to know me. Let's rewind, and I'm going to focus most of my story around my worship leading career, my church career, because that's what our podcast really focuses on the most. And so we're going to rewind back to young Patrick growing up in Orlando, Florida. My dad is a pastor at a large Southern Baptist church. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. Both my parents are from Tennessee. But eventually he got this job at a large Southern Baptist church in Orlando, Florida, and said, hey, I'm going to take my family there. So at the ripe age of 2, I made the move to Orlando, Florida, Disney Town. And everyone, when I say nowadays, when I say, oh, I'm from Orlando, people say, what part of Orlando? Which is kind of new to me. I didn't say that growing up. But like, yeah, Disney. Like, I worked at Disney as a teenager. And it's an interesting place to live, interesting place to be. But I grew up in that Southern Baptist church. And, being a Southern Baptist church, it was pretty reserved, very conservative. There are probably a lot of views that if I had stayed in Florida, would be very different than the views I have now. Different things I've been able to experience because, life moves you to different places. But that's where I grew up. And I remember, being really involved in sports and at some point getting involved in music. And the way I got involved in music, this is kind of Yalitza Taylor, Nicole Taylor, Wesley Taylor, if you guys are listening, I'm so thankful for your family because I remember this so vividly. I'm in 2nd grade. The school, which was attached to the church, is about to put on this Go America 4th of July concert. And there was this duet that they wanted a young man and a young woman to sing. It was, proud to be an American, which aren't we all? Relax, everybody. And my music teacher is like, who would like to audition for this part? Now, as a 2nd grader, maybe 4th grader, I don't remember. As a young person, she goes around the room and she's like, oh, Tabitha, you would like to audition. Oh, Heather, you would like to. And then she points at me and goes, you're auditioning. I had no interest to sing whatsoever. But I said, okay. And I went home and my mom made me religiously practice with, the cassette tape. And I went in and I nailed it. Crushed the audition, everybody. Who's surprised? 0 people are surprised. And I went on to go and sing, by the way, I sang with the crush of my young life. This young lady, I shouldn't even say her name, but I was just like, oh my gosh, I get to sing with her. Nailed it, brought the house down. And from that point on, I started singing and then I got into guitar. And oh my gosh, when I started playing guitar, I found, thanks to Kevin Duffy, if you're listening, I found Metallica. Oh, and I just went on a rock and roll frenzy, learning all these guitar parts. It was amazing. At one point, I began singing so much in different plays and things like that I didn't know this, but behind the scenes, someone approached my music teacher, Yalitza Taylor, and said, we need someone to come and sing on these kids' praise tapes. It's a gig. It's a paid gig. Would your son do it? And she said, he's too young. He was a couple years behind me. He's too young. You should ask Patrick. I begin singing. I have this agent that sends me out to all these these studios throughout Florida to sing on kids' praise tapes, and it eventually graduates to the point where we are singing all of the vocals for Barney tapes. Barney, the purple dinosaur, that is me. Anytime I'm in a group of people, in a church setting or anywhere, and they're doing an icebreaker, what's one interesting fact that people don't know about you? People are like, I have, 4 toes on one, all these things. Mine is always, I don't know why I went to the toes, forgive me. Mine is always, I sang for Barney. Brings the house down every time. So what's funny about that story is I went and sung for Barney. I did all these kids' praise tapes. And eventually one day I walk into the studio and they're like, okay, Patrick, here's what you're singing today. My voice changed way late. I'm 13 at this point. And I'm singing and I can't hit the notes they're asking me to sing. And my agent says, oh, Patrick, we're going to start having to book you for some adult recording sessions. They never called me again. I was out of the biz. And what's even more funny about that story is Yalitza Taylor's son, Wesley Taylor, who she said, he's too young, send Patrick. He is now on Broadway. So there's that. I could have been a star, you guys. If she had passed me up and went with it, maybe it could have, I don't know. But here we are. So right around that time, right around 13, I'm way into music, I'm playing guitar. My Sunday school teacher, remember Sunday school? My Sunday school teacher comes up to me and says, and this is when like worship music beyond like a choir and an orchestra, like a live band is becoming more popular. And he says, Patrick, you play guitar, put together a band, lead the praise team, remember that, for Sunday school. So I basically put together a praise and worship Metallica style cover band that just was great. It was like, so many people were like, that's too loud. I remember a day where I was leading a few songs and we put down the electric guitars and I was about to pick up my acoustic guitar and a young lady in the front row of my Sunday school goes, finally, back to the acoustics. Anyway, so I start like leading worship teams. I'm dealing with like scheduling vocalists. I'm 13, right? And I do that all throughout high school. I do it at like my Christian school chapels, and I do it, my band gets like hired to go lead worship at camps and things like that. It was a really interesting experience. And my Southern Baptist church growing up, they had pretty stringent rules. Like, you know, if you were a certain age, you fit within a certain ministry. Like if you were 18 or 19, you had to go to like the college or the young adults ministry. You couldn't be at the youth group anymore. And it was kind of like this hard transition because this world I knew just ended. And it was now time for me to go and be a part of like the young adult ministry, which was like not thriving at that time. It was kind of like in the church as a whole, just not thriving. And I was just like, oh man, I'm going to leave my friends. I'm going to leave the worship team that I'm a part of. I have to go like do this new thing. This is going to be so hard. And also at that time, my family was kind of like falling apart. You know, my parents are getting a divorce. My brother has just gone to college. I'm on my own. I am clinically diagnosed ADHD, depressed, you know, really some dark thoughts, dark times, you know, crying at the drop of a hat, like beyond like teenager stuff. I was really like struggling. And instead of going to the young adults ministry at my Southern Baptist church, I say to myself, I've never made a church decision on my own. I've always gone where my family's at. And I said, maybe it's time for me to make my own decision. I decide to go down the street just a few miles to the non-denominational church. Now, why did I pick there? So I went to a school that was attached to the church that my dad was a pastor at. My mom taught at the school, a Christian school, and all the kids there went to this Baptist church that the school is attached to, except for a few kids who went to this non-denominational church a few miles away, a couple miles away. And it was really interesting because back then there was this like competition where I'll just say me, I know it was more of an us situation, but me, I viewed these non-denominational kids as not as holy. Our school would not allow them to promote like prayer or worship or youth events. We could only promote what was in our church. We were doing it right. They were doing it wrong. They would open up their youth ministry with a secular song. Oh my God, you know, what'll they do? Just terrible things, of course. And it was the only church that I was familiar with beyond my own because some of my friends went there. And we would have conversations as high schoolers, like, why do you guys do this? Or why is the music so loud at your church? Or things like that. And man, it was just like high schoolers figuring stuff out. But I say, that's the only other experience I know of. I'll go there. I walk in the door of that youth ministry, and it was kind of like, I'm not cool, but I walked in and you could tell that people were like, oh my gosh, Patrick Murphy's here. His dad's a pastor at that Baptist church. His mom teaches at the school that's attached to or a part of that Baptist church. What is he doing here? He said openly that we're not doing it right and his church is. And I was going through that family stuff, and I walked in, and I so vividly remember walking like a few rows down the aisle of this big auditorium, sitting down and weeping. I wasn't being watched by people, a group where everybody knew me. I was just kind of able to process on my own without feeling like I was being watched. And I wept as a 18-year-old, just wept. Now, little did I know, I believe I was truly having an encounter with Holy Spirit. And he was just allowing me to be sad, meeting me in that sadness. I felt freedom. And, this church, being a non-denominational church, watched me weep on the third row from the back the first time I was there. But they also knew I was a worship leader. So like week 2, they said, will you help us lead worship? Now, this was like an established ministry, but like, an established church, but this established ministry is non-denominational churches. We love building teams. We love recruiting people. And looking back, that was such an unhealthy choice from the leadership to be like, please come play. You're an emotional wreck. But it kind of put me on a path of like what I'm doing now, and I'm thankful for it. So I began leading worship there, and eventually that youth ministry splits into high school and middle school. And I become the middle school worship leader. Fast forward a little bit more time, and the guy who's been leading high school worship for like decades goes, hey man, it's time for me to step down, and I want you to step in and take my role and be both the middle school and the high school guy. Along with this change, we're actually going to we're going to pay you money. And I was like, what? And he goes, and also, since you're now stepping in, some little guitar player kid, Greg's mom is over there. She's mad at how he's not getting to play as much as he wants to. So your first order of business, I need you to go talk to his mom and smooth things over. So I'm like immediately thrown in the trenches by this guy. I'm given a job at a church. I'm now on staff at a church. Like so many new things. It was crazy. It's crazy. And so I began working there, and I'm working part-time in restaurants. Like I was a server at like Ruby Tuesdays, and then this restaurant called the Ale House, and then part-time at the church. Between shifts at the restaurant, I'm like in a booth, like writing out worship sets and calling band members to check in on them. It was nuts. But I became this like youth, or what they referred to as the next gen worship pastor, worship leader. At some point, the youth pastor over all of those ministries leaves and moves on. He actually got a job at another super, super large church in another state. And the search begins for our new boss, our new youth pastor. And eventually I meet a guy that's still my friend today, and he becomes my boss. And that was the first time I began working with someone who was like apostolic, all about like church planting, advancing the kingdom. All the other people that I had worked with, of course, cared about the lost, cared about people, cared about their neighborhood. And this guy wanted to see like the world change, And so much so that he takes me and the rest of his staff to the Mosaic conference in LA with Erwin McManus. And Erwin's up there talking about church planting and missions. And in the middle of, I'll never forget this, in the middle of one of the sessions at this conference, I lean over to him and I go, I guess it was loud enough for like other people in our row to hear me. I go, dude, what are we doing here? Like our church doesn't plant churches. Like, what are we doing here? This is all about like missions. And he goes, be quiet. He goes, be quiet. You're blowing up my spot. And later on pulled me aside and privately said, man, I'm not going to be in Florida forever. These guys hired me to be at this church, and I love it, and I'm thankful for them. But I told them coming in that one day I was going to go plant a church in a major city. And it's about time for me to do that. And I went, now remember, at this time, my family has fallen apart. I'm a little lost. I'm looking at him as, unfairly to him, I'm looking at him as like a bit of a father figure. And so, of course, selfishly, when he says, I'm going to go do something, what's my first question? Well, what am I going to do? And he says, I want you to come with me. Now, he hadn't told me where he's planting a church. He hasn't told me when. He just said, I'm going. And my first question is, well, what do I do? And he goes, I want you to come with me. And then with 5 seconds of prayerful consideration, I say, okay. Because I was just, at that point in my life, I was so used to making, pretty drastic transitions on my own that I just decided to go. I said, sure. Now, here's where things get really cool, because during that time, serving in another ministry, or within this youth, next gen, college, I was at that point leading worship for the college ministry, the middle school, the high school, under this guy. And we had started this, check this out. We had actually started a college ministry that did not exist at this non-denominational church. The church added a wing to the side of the building that was a smaller they called it the gallery, a smaller stage, just maybe 100 chairs for smaller events, and as an overflow room for Sundays. And being the apostolic guy that he is, my boss says, I want to book that every Sunday night to start a college ministry. And they looked right back at him and said, we'll let you do this, but you have to have 100 people the first night. And if you ever dip below 100 people, you lose that time slot. Isn't that crazy? And so first night we had 120 people, and it just grew and grew and blew up from there. Really, I hate to use this word, it was really popular ministry, but lives were changed. And out of that, we were going to go start a church somewhere else. And there were people that were like, we'd like to join you. It was a really cool time. But during that time, I also met my best friend, the love of my life, my partner in crime, my wife, Teresa. And that's an interesting thing, because at that time, I was never good at dating. Nobody taught me how to have good relationships and healthy boundaries and things like that. And I used to talk to my now partner, Teresa, and say, oh, I'm talking to this girl. I think she really likes me. I think she might be the one. Meanwhile, my now wife is like, I knew that girl was not into you at all. But I was so bad, I could not read the room. And eventually I started to realize, man, this best friend, I'm starting to have romantic feelings for her. So we go to Starbucks, I sit down with her, and I say, now I'm going to have her on the podcast, and she is going to she's going to have a different version of this story. I'm just letting you know. But I say to her, hey, Teresa, what if we dated? And she said, well, what about this other girl you've been talking about? I go, well, obviously she doesn't like me, so I'm trying something else, and I like you, and she goes, I mean, okay. And I say, let's go to Carrabba's tonight. Carrabba's, guys, come on. Only the classiest stuff for the Murphys. And she says, I mean, that sounds okay. Now, little did I know, years later she would tell me that she went home and she bought a new outfit, and she was so excited because she was in love with me, guys. I mean, look at me. Clearly a catch. Okay, relax. And if you're not looking at me because you're listening to a podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you're welcome. Anyway, so she becomes the love of my life. And my boss at the time, who had asked me to come and plant this church with him somewhere else in a major city, he says, I'd like you, Teresa, to come and be our children's pastor. And she said, absolutely. So we had this plan as a dating couple to both go to New York. But one day, at some point, she calls me up and she goes, are we getting married? And I said, yes. And then it became, well, I guess we're going to live together in New York. And what happened was we got engaged June 2nd of 2005, married July 23rd of 2005, and moved to the city to an apartment we had never seen before that we decided to rent, a 12 by 12, because that matters, studio apartment in New York City that cost $1,350 a month. That's $1,350 a month on August 4th. June 2nd, engaged. July 23rd, married, moved to the city, New York City, August 4th. That's where we decided to go plant churches. Now, it was originally going to be Vegas, but then my boss at the time switched it to New York City. Now, we moved to New York City thinking that we're going to plant this big time mega church in New York City, just like we had done, been part of a larger church in Florida. It was hard. It was so hard to be in New York. It was brutal. We struggled. And No, we're still here. We're here 17 years later, and we have 3 little boys who are amazing. And my wife at one point was like, well, actually, let me get to that a little bit later. So we're doing great. We're still here. But those first few years and the current years we're in are difficult, man. But instead of creating one large church in New York City, we decided to start, or I shouldn't say we decided, we were given the opportunity to plant about 12 different churches. We're talking like, we started in the Upper West, then we went Upper East, Brooklyn, East Village, Tribeca, another church in Brooklyn, and like on down the line. We just had Washington Heights, like all these different places. And throughout that time, Teresa and I are moving to different apartments. We lived Upper West, Wash Heights, Stuytown, East Village. And at one point, I was working at that time, and I was no longer working in restaurants. I was working at the Apple store in Soho, and I was working part-time at the church. And I was working in the Upper East Side location. Now, throughout that first period of working in New York City at the churches that I was a part of, there came a time where like I began to get really disillusioned. Like, planning a church is much like being like in a startup, and there will come a point where your heart can get fried, your brain can get fried, and you're just like, I'm really struggling. And rest is such a value. And I did not have that discipline in my life of rest. And at one point, my boss looked at me and he said, hey, we're going to cut your salary. Because I wasn't living up to like an expectation. And I could get into like tons of details about that, but I'm not going to. Maybe another time. And then another time he sits me down and he goes, Patrick, I can tell you're struggling so much that I'm willing for you to hate me. I'm willing to fire you so that you can move away and your life gets better or easier. And you may hate me for that, but I'm going to fire you for your betterment. Man, that was a reality check. And so he said, but I haven't quite decided yet. So for 6 months, I worked at this church that had multiple churches that I was supporting and helping, not knowing if the next day I would have a job or not. It's crazy. And here I am talking, you may be thinking like, oh my gosh, how terrible. Listen, we were all learning on the job. It was a hard time. I'm still friends with all those people today. I mean, love it. Love those guys. And we made tons of mistakes along the way. And I'm not even saying having that meeting with me, having that conversation with me, making that decision with me would have been a mistake. I'm just simply saying that if you're sitting here and going, wow, that's really harsh. Well, we were all learning. We were all learning on the job. And we actually talk about it to this day. We'll have a conversation about it. But long story short, I stuck around and I didn't give up. And I'm actually thankful for that because there are so many people I've seen, hit like a huge trial like that. And I'm not saying I process it well, but I did just simply stick around. I just thought it was right for me to stick around. I was really stubborn about it. But that's just the decision I made and me and Teresa made. And it was a hard one. And here I am. And I remained part-time at Apple, part-time at the church, part-time at Apple, part-time at the church. And then this guy comes along and decides that he wants to start a church with us in the East Village. I was working in the Upper East Side at the time, and he said, I'd like you to be my worship guy here. So you will have a part-time role in the Upper East Side, part-time role in the East Village. You are now a full-time worship pastor in New York City. Crazy. Blew my mind. And I walked in. I remember this is so bad. I secretly recorded the conversation with me talking to my HR manager at Apple saying, hey, it's time for me to leave. I had so many good relationships in that store. I loved that company. I did really well at Apple. I was at one point like a mini manager. I was number 26. Apple, like worldwide, I was number 26 in sales. It's crazy. And I recorded that conversation because she was like, oh my gosh, we're going to miss you. And it was so encouraging and it was so thankful and all of that. And so now I was a full-time worship leader in New York City. It's crazy, right? Now, I was still working in 2 different locations. Like I said, it was about 12 churches altogether. And at one point, all those churches, actually every year, all those churches would go and do a retreat together out in the woods somewhere, and we'd all worship together and pray together and hear about, like things that we're all doing collectively or things that we're all doing individually. Just get on the same page, just worship, have fun. I would lead there, really powerful times. And this guy who was our pastor in Queens, at our church in Queens, New York, one stop on the 7 train from Grand Central. He says, and we knew each other. We'd had like maybe a conversation here or there, 1 or 2 coffees. He said, hey, can I talk to you for 5 minutes? And literally for 5 minutes, he walked around this field with me one time. And he said, I'd like you to come work full-time for me. I know you're here part-time and here part-time, making a full-time role. I want you to work in one location full-time. That blew my mind. Now, immediately, because of like the journey I'd had of being told like, hey, we're cutting your salary, you might get fired. My family kind of being a disaster for quite some time in my childhood. Immediately I go into defense mechanism. I go to my original boss, the guy who brought me to New York, and say, hey, is someone trying to get rid of me? Are you guys like pawning me off into one location because I'm not doing well here? And instead of being like, hey, this is like a good thing, which is what he looked at me and said. He said, hey, stop. I hear your concern, but this is a good thing. This is a good thing. Everybody's on board with this. It's a good move. And I'm really thankful for that move because we decided that we were going to move to Queens. Now, if you're watching a movie and it says, hey, we're going to go to New York, and it shows that skyline view of the city, my neighborhood is the neighborhood that's like looking at that view. Long Island City, where I live now. It's this beautiful neighborhood. And literally you get on from Grand Central, one of the busiest hubs in New York City. You get on the 7 train, one stop, you're in Long Island City. And it's great because you're kind of like a part of the city, but just like one step removed from all the Manhattan madness, which I absolutely love. It's also just a cool neighborhood. We're so thankful for where we live, thankful for our building. We're actually in the process of moving to a new apartment. Anyway, that's another story. But so I come out and I begin working full-time in Queens at this our church in Queens, still connected to the whole. A few years later, see a lot of growth there. One of my jobs was moving us into a more stable location. I did that. Refining systems. I did that. Raising up worship leaders. I did that. Created this really cool discipleship program for worship leaders that I still do today. And at some point, all of our pastors get together and they sit around a table. About 12, 13 different pastors. And one of them says, guys, I think it's time that, I love you guys. There was no huge, I hate this phrase, he had a moral failure. Whatever. Why do we have to always use these fancy terms? There was no huge failure. There was no sin. There was no drama. There was no arguing or tension. Just one of our pastors said, hey, I kind of want to move out on my own, and I want my church to be like its own thing. And that kind of shook things up. And we, as a single network of churches, dispersed. And some people said, I'm going to make my church my own church. Some people moved away. It was kind of like a shifting time. And for me, this, I was watching what I came here to start disintegrate, or what became the thing that I came here to start. I watched it to kind of fizzle out. And I was like, oh my gosh, is it time for me and Teresa to move away? At this point, my wife has decided, she doesn't, she worked at the church for quite some time. And she said, what, she was a teacher before that. She said, I'm going to get back into education. I think that's where I'm supposed to be. And she has this, she has just been shown so much favor as an educator. So she's entrenched in the DOE, the public school education in New York City, a highly contentious space, a very beautiful place where she's making a difference. I am working full time at a location in a church, experiencing more life than I ever have. And then I start to see things kind of dwindle, and we're like, wait, is it time for us to go? Is this God saying we're free to go as well, or whatever language you want to use? And we're like, I don't know. I think we should just kind of wait it out and see what happens. And in the midst of all that, my boss at the time, on April Fool's Day, says, hey, I want you and your wife to come to dinner with me and my wife. And I said, yeah, sure. And we show up and he says, so you know how our church is kind of disbanding and we're all becoming our own churches. Our church network is disbanding, I should say. I say, yeah. He goes, well, it's time for us to move on as well. And I looked at him on April Fool's Day and I went, shut up. Like, you're kidding, whatever. And then he looks back at me and goes, this is not a joke. I'm serious. Now, at this point, I've experienced so much transition that I just looked at him and I go, dude, I'm happy for you. Where are you headed? He's like, oh, church here. I said, oh, tell me about it. And we start talking. And then I look over to my right and he looks over to his left because we're sitting across from each other. And both of our wives are just weeping. And I go, oh my gosh, we forgot the emotional part. And so we decide to be emotional for a little bit. And then I'm like, hey man, this is really sad, but I'm happy for you. That brings on more questions. My wife and I are like, is it time for us to go? Whatever. And what's so cool is this young guy who was actually a part of my volunteer teams at that church had begun volunteering more in like a staff role and gaining like all this leadership experience. And he had just gotten his MDiv. And my boss said, I think I'm going to ask him to be the lead pastor and take over for me. And so that guy became my boss. And that is the shortest version of how I got to where I am today. And then throughout all of that, there's been so many things I've learned about leading worship, about discipleship, about how God speaks and what the Holy Spirit does, and how we as the church are way more alike than we are different, and how the world just needs love and needs Jesus, and how, being in New York City, how it's powerful to be around people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, and how some people are called to be in the churches that set up and tear down every week, and and some people aren't, and some people are meant to be in a role where they wear tons of hats like me, and some people are meant to be in extremely specialized roles where they do 1 or 2 or 5 things really, really well. We're just so different, and my experience has shown me that. I am now getting to that point where I'm kind of an old church guy. I am just turned 40. And I still think there's things for me to share, things for me to do. And I've never wanted to be, I find myself just continuing to remember this. When I was young, did I want to be a cool worship leader? Yeah. I just don't care about being cool anymore. I don't want to have a great album. As a matter of fact, I don't write songs, but I love collaborating with people on their songs. I actually do that well. But I don't do writing on my own well. It's not a discipline for me. However, creativity when it comes to content creation, I do that well, and I do that on my own. So throughout the years, I've just seen a ton of things, experienced a ton of things, and I have so much more that I want to see and experience, especially when it comes to what God wants to do. And this podcast is a way for you not just to hear my story, but to hear the story of others. And I hope it blesses you. And I hope this is, at the very least, I hope some of these episodes are interesting. But before we got into those, I wanted you to meet me for a little bit. So thanks for listening. Thanks so much for taking the time to, just like spend a little time getting to know me. And I would love to get to know you. So please take some time to, rate the podcast. Take some time to comment. Take some time to ask any questions you might have. This podcast, these videos, this YouTube channel, this is not here just for me. It's actually here for you guys. I would love to get to know you more, and I hope, and I just hope that it becomes a community where we can engage with one another. Feel free to click the links down below to follow me, to stay in touch with me, or to get in touch with me, and I will see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for joining us. Links to everything you need can be found in the description. And as always, if you need to get a hold of us, you can shoot us an email at theundignifiedworship@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram @thisisundignifiedworship. We'll see you next time.